has helped shape the life of Hillfield Friary in Dorset by an integral ecology, one that is environmental, social and spiritual. And as he said, he now lives in a friary in Plaistow in East London. Dr. Claire Redfern is the editor of Green Christian magazine. Green Christian is a UK-wide volunteer-led organisation that shares a wealth of resources and encouragement, both spiritual and practical, with its members, with the wider church and beyond. And there's some literature from Green Christian, again, on the side, and that you can actually help yourself do and take away. She originally trained here in Cambridge as a doctor and practiced for several years, but then retrained and learned more and more about, through the Open University, on climate change, renewable energy and sustainable technology. And as a member of the congregation here at Great St Mary's 10 years ago, she resurrected the church eco group, which among other things persuaded the parochial church council to install 46 solar panels on the south roof of the church, which was quite an undertaking. And she was also the diocesan environmental advisor. Dr. Richard Davis is Vice Principal and Director of the Centre for Faith in Public Life at Wesley House in Cambridge. And he teaches and supervises in Christian ethics and contextual, political and public theology. He's formerly a faculty member at the Pacific Theological College in Fiji and has published in Pacific theology and social ethics in the region. And his research interests are diverse, but include eco-theology and climate change and faith-based activism. He's also a member of the congregation here at Great St Mary's and part of our public theology group. Dr. Charlotte Hammer is Assistant Professor in Health Security and Infectious Diseases at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the university here, and she's a Fellow in Epidemiology of Downing College. Her research focuses on outbreak science, pandemic preparedness and health security, particularly in the context of complex systems shaped by socio and ecological vulnerability. So some of the stuff that we commonly refer to as the kind of polycrisis. She's particularly interested in how converging global challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, political instability and violence create fragile environments in which epidemic tipping points are more likely to occur. She's also a member of the congregation at Great St Mary's, and it was her idea to start a conversation between scientists in the field of existential risk and theologians, and here we are trying it out. And finally, Professor Don Broom was appointed the world's first professor of animal welfare in 1986. In his Centre for Animal Welfare and Anthrozoology, he developed concepts and methods of scientific assessment of animal welfare and studied cognitive abilities of animals, the welfare of farmed and other animals in relation to housing and transport, the behaviour problems of pets, sustainable livestock production and attitudes to animals and ethics of animal usage. He's also a member of the congregation here and a current member of our environment group. A little whistle-stop tour through our panellists, and I'd like to thank them again very much indeed for being here. We have a few questions that have emerged out of our discussions, and I'll start with one that sounds a little complex, but we'll break it down into stages. We talk a lot about saving the planet. That's a phrase that we use often, but we sometimes mean, I think, saving ourselves. So my first question for our panellists is there still hope of a livable planet for all of humanity, not just some of humanity? And what is the relationship between human survival and flourishing and the survival and flourishing of non-human life? Big question. Charlotte, I don't know whether you're happy to start with something about what existential risk and threat does to human behaviours. Does it make us more selfish, less selfish? Over to you.
That sounds very much like it's working.
It is.
Massive question. Very challenging to address. So I'll try to give my 2 cents and then hope the panel can fill in, because I'm probably going to leave more gaps than you might think there are now. Existential risk is an incredibly challenging thing for human beings to grapple with, because it is sort of counter to how we want to see the world. Even the individual existential risk of death is already something that human beings tend to struggle with. be it in phase or be it outside of phase, indeed. And existential risk really elevates this to a whole of species level. So from that point of view already, we're talking about something that is very challenging. And on the scientific side, we very often spend substantial time debating whether something is existential or, as we would say, merely global catastrophic. Now, obviously, once we reach a level of global catastrophic, which, by the way, also does not have a clear definition and a clear threshold, we are talking about destruction on a level that we do not want to see. I think no sane human being wants to see that level of destruction, be that of the human and the non-human world. But in a way, such debates sort of detract from the importance of thinking about mitigation of these risks, because mitigation and thinking about mitigation of these risks actually requires us to acknowledge that they do exist, and that is deeply, deeply scary. But as we've heard in the sermon, for those of us who've been at Evensong, we are grappling with a multitude of these problems that intersect, as was just mentioned, in what is often referred to as a polycrisis. And indeed, we are surpassing planetary boundaries again and again. We are creating a world that is inherently incompatible with human life and indeed with non-human life. Now, whether we want to see this as separated or linked, so the human and the non-human of the planet, ultimately, in my opinion, actually doesn't matter. Because if we continue as we are continuing at the moment, it will be uninhabitable for all forms of life at some point. So caring about the planet just because we care about ourselves as humans, still massively better than not caring about the planet. So I, quite frankly, will take it, but I'm also a massive pragmatist.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to come in now and say something perhaps about the all of humanity aspect?
Yeah, we tend to think about all of humanity, but I think sometimes we need to break that down as well, because there have been a number of existential risks throughout history. I used to teach a course, Theology of Disasters, and the first disaster in that course is the destruction of Jerusalem, which was absolutely catastrophic and the end of Judaism as they knew it at the time. Other massive existential risks for different smaller communities were the Black Death, of course, a third of Europe's population gone. The Spanish influenza was another one that threatened the globe with mass dying. Whole communities have been wiped off the face of the earth through floods. And in the Pacific, where I taught, low-lying nations like Tuvalu are especially vulnerable. And what does it mean to have a nation without land is the challenge they're facing. Now, of course, this is a huge question for international law and migration and refugees. And for those who are concerned about migration as an existential risk to the United Kingdom, need to think carefully about what is the impact of climate change on migration. One of the big issues in the Pacific is the ongoing occupation by Indonesia of West Papua. That was a former Dutch colony taken over by Indonesia, and now there's a massive human rights abuses there and an ongoing struggle for independence. Now, Indonesia, through sea level rise, is facing 1 million refugees a year due to sea level rise. They've even had to move the capital city in Indonesia. Now, West Papua is a mountainous region. A lot of settlers are going into West Papua from Indonesia. So that poses an existential risk to the people of West Papua, which we never hear about, but that is directly related to climate change, and it's directly related to mineral extraction in that land, and that's catastrophic for the people there. So we can think on a global perspective, but there's also a lot of existential risks for individual communities in the Pacific and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's clear issues of justice and the particular threat of climate change affecting different parts of the world very, very differently, and then secondary impacts through migration because of those effects, which is, all of this is huge. Sam, I don't know whether you want to add anything to what you said in your sermon about the particular Franciscan perspective on the relationship between non-human and human life in all of this ecology.
I think I already have touched on that. I mean, Francis had this deep, deep sense of kinship with all that is, a deep sense that we belong together. Life hangs together, which I think actually is just fact. I mean, it's a fact which we ignore, but it is actually fact. And I think his sort of keen awareness of it and his living of it, I mean, it just has something really important to say in that. He was also, of course, he came from the perspective of God's passion for the poor and the vulnerable. And I think that so a Franciscan approach is always going to be looking at that, those on the margins.
Thank you. And Don, I don't know whether you want to come in and say anything specifically about the animal welfare here.
Yes, thank you. I would say that at the moment, the really big issues are that there is too much focus on human activity and too much short-term thinking about what is going on in the world. So most people are thinking very much about their next few weeks and months of living and not thinking very much about the longer term for humans and for non-humans. And talking about the planet, I see as mostly about the living things on the planet, rather. I don't think we're going to see destruction physically of the planet. We are seeing destruction of living things on the planet. So at this moment, I think that the greatest problem is biodiversity loss, and it's not just the diversity, it's the number of individuals. So we have a situation where, because of the activities which people are doing as a result of the economics of living, like agriculture and other everyday activities, we are seeing vast numbers of individual animals and plants being killed by human action. I mean, just ploughing up the land kills thousands and thousands of living individuals. So that's killing lots of individuals, and some of the changes are resulting in the loss of whole species, the extinction of species, and there we have a long list of the extinctions we know about. There are lots of extinctions which are occurring which we hardly know about. So people are too short-term in their thinking. They're thinking too much about humans and not much about other species, and I see that as the number one issue in the world. I think for humans that there is a major problem of not thinking enough about human health. Actually, antimicrobial resistance is probably the biggest problem in the world for humans. That is that we have antibiotics at the moment. We are starting to get lots of strains which are resistant to antibiotics because people have been misusing antibiotics and other antimicrobials, and that is already resulting in lots of diseases which used to be controllable being less controllable. So for humans, that's a very major, very important issue, and you're very concerned with that, I know. But for the world at large, I think it's impacts on non-human species causing mass death and large level of extinction. And so I didn't answer in relation to animal welfare. I think it is a wider thing than that, and actually most of what I've been writing in the last 10 years have been about sustainability in general of systems.
Thank you, Don. Claire?
Well, I just want to bring it back to climate change. Interesting what you said, Don, but I think, you know, the effect on human populations across the globe is really important. I mean, it is already an existential risk, and there have been, hundreds, thousands die each year in severe weather events, and there are famines, and there is encroaching desertification. So, people are finding it increasingly hard to, especially in the poorest parts of the world. And eventually, as someone pointed out, I think it was Charlotte, that's going to be coming here too. I mean, we're on track for at least 3 to 4 degrees of warming if we carry on with business as usual by the end of the century, and that's going to severely affect food supplies. But on the subject of food, also I have a question that you might be able to answer, Don, about the relationship between survival and flourishing. I mean, one of the things we really need to do amongst keeping fossil fuels on the ground is change our diet, and 80% of agricultural land is used to rear animals intensively on the whole. So I just wondered if that might be something we could pursue, whether changing our diet, reducing more plant-based might actually improve biodiversity as well as reducing the risks of climate change.
That actually links to the next question that we have in some ways, in that it's a what do we change, what do we sacrifice, what do we do differently ourselves, and diet is one of the things that we have some individual control over. So I wonder whether I might ask the next question, and then we can try and fold in our answers to that as we go along, if that's okay. So the next question we've got here is, why should I give things up personally when it makes no difference unless everyone else does? Or to put it another way, to what extent is hope an individual matter or a communal matter? And how much of a sacrifice is it to change the way we eat, change the way we travel, change the way that we live? And does anything make that easier or more difficult, making those sorts of changes? I know that you can address any of those aspects to it as you like. We'll start with Richard and then perhaps move to Don on that particular point.
Okay, I teach a short course at Wesley House called Preaching the Good News into the Climate Crisis. And during the introductions of one of these courses, I asked people, why are you doing this course? And this woman said to the group, I was a Methodist, a local preacher, and I've taken myself off the roster because I have no hope to offer anyone, and I'm doing this course to regain a sense of hope. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's a lot of pressure. So I had to come up with something on hope, so we're talking about hope as a theological virtue, and I think hope is not an individual virtue. It's a virtue that's gained and sustained by collective action. When I see a lot of people, getting stuck into some ecological protest or action or something, that gives me hope. Hope's not something I'm going to conjure up within myself sitting watching TV, especially at the moment. So I think the collective action, communities, the fact that we're here today talking about these issues gives me hope because people are interested in the topic and so on. So this very evening gives me hope. I think, so some of that collective action is also about what we do politically and so on. And I think some of the individual actions that we all know about are important, but there's also collective actions I think we need to do. And I think some of the things we need to give up. I think we need to give up wars. Wars are a huge contributor to climate change. During the first Gulf War, they were flying B-52 bombers from continental USA to Iraq. Can you imagine, and we're asked to, reduce, using straws while the governments of this world are blowing people apart. Even the reconstruction afterwards, we saw the destruction of Gaza. To rebuild Gaza, even to what it was, the climate emissions from that are just massive. And removing the rubble, the concrete involved, huge emissions. So we need to give up on wars. We also need to give up on billionaires because their emissions are massive. disproportionate, out of control, private jets, a lavish lifestyle that we can't afford. Alongside that, I think we need to be have great suspicion about two technological things that some of us barely understand. The first is Bitcoin. The emissions related to Bitcoin is greater than Kenya, greater than New Zealand. So I don't know if anyone here has Bitcoin, but probably not. But Bitcoin mining is done by these supercomputers that burn up a lot of energy. They need a lot of water to cool them. And the same is with AI. Now, we should be very suspicious of AI. As an educator, I am. But also just the emissions related to AI due to their huge energy use and the water involved in cooling these supercomputers is something that I just don't think we can afford environmentally. Irrespective of the other impacts. So that's my response.
Thank you. And thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Don and Charlotte, between you, I wonder whether you might want to talk about perhaps how research might inform policies that then enable that collective action, things that we do all together rather than just individually. And this might be where we can talk particularly about practices and policies enabled by governments and industry around farming might be one of those, and you might have other examples. So perhaps Don first and then Charlotte.
Yes, so I think most people would say that everything that we do, whether we're talking about producing food, producing buildings, travelling from place to place, everything, we ought to try to do it in a sustainable way, in a way which is going to go on into the future and which is going to be acceptable to the average person in the world. So we ought to be trying to do things in a sustainable way. And that, therefore, you need then to think about what are all the components of sustainability. And there are lots of different ones. And when I've been trying to write about how you evaluate sustainability of particular systems, mainly to do with food, but there are many aspects, and we've talked about most of them. We've talked about the cost in terms of climate, impact on the climate. We've talked about the cost in terms of biodiversity and loss of life, where we hear about how much water is being used, how much land is being used, what's the impact on people and their everyday life, and is it making them move from one place to another? So we ought to be looking for every system we talk about, what are all the components of the sustainability of that system, and then we should be evaluating those properly in a good scientific way. And so we have a situation now where many things are being talked about and few things are being adequately evaluated. So the sustainability of you gave a couple of examples, Richard, but a situation where climate change is being modified in a way which results in whole areas that humans can live in disappearing is something which most people would feel shouldn't continue. So what do we do about that? We reduce our impact on the climate. There are situations where we have changes in the climate which are resulting, and you mentioned it, Claire, in desertification of regions of the world. So it's already the case that there are areas which used to produce a lot of food, which now produce a lot less food because it's got hotter. And that's going to continue if we continue to see climate change. And then the people who live in those places, what will they do? In some cases, they'll move somewhere else. And so we'll get a lot more people migrating to other places where they can still get food or get jobs. And so we are obviously all going to welcome them when all these people coming from the hot parts of the world who can't live there anymore are going to try and move to Cambridgeshire. Everybody is going to say, welcome, we're all very pleased to see you. And that is not the message we get from politicians very much at the moment. And then the other way of doing it is to invade. So you're in the country which is losing its possibility to produce food. Okay, you invade another country which is doing a bit better. That kind of change could occur, and that's just talking about climate. So there are some quite big changes which could be very, very negative in the future. But we need to be evaluating them. We need to be measuring them. We need to be assessing and trying to decide what are the things to do. And most people are actually saying, I'm very keen to do my bit. And everybody can do something about all of these different factors in sustainability. Everybody can do something, but a lot of people are saying, I'd like to do something as long as it doesn't cost me 1% of my income. If you say to people, okay, it's going to cost you 1% of your income, will you do it? It's amazing how many people who say no to that. And so there is this very, very difficult, it's a change in thinking about the whole world which is needed. The more communication there is, the more the message is spread around to people that there are some changes which are needed, and it does mean it's going to cost you, it's going to make it more expensive for you to do things. So I think that is the kind of thing which is a very difficult thing to get out to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Don. That sacrifice is an unpopular concept, I think, generally in society, whether that's things costing more or giving things up. I mean, having a thing but paying more for it, or choosing to not have that thing. Charlotte, do you want to say something from your perspective on any of this?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you. You've given me a wonderful introduction, because I would go one, to me, very essential step further. Because we talk about having to understand, having to assess, and then having to take action. But I think both in research and in policy making, indeed, we forget one really essential step in this, at least most of the time. We are still treating a lot of these phenomena as bounded phenomena. And that is no longer the case. We see interaction between risks. We see risk amplifying one another. We see areas where, even if we look at bounded phenomena, we already see massive impact of climate change, desertification, war, migration, all at the same time. So we're no longer in a position where we can just look at individual things. We can no longer afford just to sit within our disciplinary silos. Very traditional research is disciplinarily bounded. Now, it is hard not to do that. It is incredibly hard to educate people in an interdisciplinary way. But to some degrees, this is also something that gives me intense hope. Because I do work with young students who are stepping out of their disciplinary silos, who do make that leap of faith to engage with fields that they have never engaged with. And seeing someone who did an undergrad in philosophy sit next to someone who did an undergraduate in mathematics, sit next to someone who did an undergrad in international relations, talk together about ways to improve the future, to address existential and global catastrophic risks, is actually incredibly good for the soul, I have to say. And indeed, this needs to translate to policy, which is a challenge. It is a challenge, particularly in highly developed countries, because we have a structure of government that relies on disciplinary silos. It relies on individual offices, agencies, and ministries. And we need to get better at these working together. We are making first steps in that direction, but we need to get even better at it. So that is probably my biggest call in this, a call towards interdisciplinarity, both in research and in policy. And I think then, to some degree, we also have to acknowledge that some of this change, no matter how sustainably we behave from here on out, is happening. It's coming. It's already here in many degrees. So we also need to look much more closely at resilience, building resilient societies here and across the globe. And that is another thing where science and research can do a massive amount of work. Indeed, there is currently a call for evidence on resilience out by the government that scientists across the country are responding to. And it is through mechanisms like this that we can also go beyond a select group of individuals being invited to publicly comment, being invited to work with policymakers, because through these big calls for evidence, as much as they are a huge burden on the government because someone has to actually read these tens of thousands of submissions, they allow other voices from across all relevant scientific fields to be heard. And that is another thing that does give me hope.
Thank you. Claire, do you want to come back and see what of all of that helped in any way answer the question that you posed? Or is there anything you'd want to do to tie up those loose ends? You did. You wanted to know about farming.
Oh, yeah. Well, it raised lots of issues, and just to come back to, is hope an individual matter or a communal matter? I would say individual actions are important. As we all know, we're all being urged to stop flying, get heat pumps, insulate our houses. And just to respond to what Charlotte was saying, and Don, I sort of feel maybe, yes, there's always work for scientists to do, evaluating and researching and publishing, but we already have the technology to live sustainably. We just don't have the encouragement from the government, from business. There aren't the sort of fiscal incentives or the, there are some incentives. I got a heat pump last year, and obviously I wouldn't have got it if there hadn't been a government grant. So that's an individual action, but I'm supporting the company that made them. And also, I was really encouraged by other people who have heat pumps in Cambridge, who I went to visit 2 of them. And they were both architects and green architects, and had loads of information and enthusiasm for it. So it's an individual, and I hope to do the same now, talking about it, my heat pump. So, it's individual actions are important, as are communal actions, but also talking about them, sharing the experience and the positive. It's not always about giving things up. I've given up having a cold home because I have a lovely heat pump that, and I've insulated a bit as well.
Thank you. It sounds to me like there's change at every level required between us. That's what we seem to be reaching a conclusion of, and that there's a role for governments, for researchers, for institutions, for commercial organisations, for community groups, to enable the kind of personal changes, but equally for personal choices to start to influence what is provided, because it starts to give a mandate to those who've got the power to perhaps facilitate some of those decisions. There's presumably the potential of a good feedback loop or a negative feedback loop, and we want to see the good kind, a virtuous circle, I suppose. Is that a fair summary?
Well, definitely. We want to ask our politicians to change policies. So, a current thing is about local renewable community power stations being able to sell their electricity locally and not having to sell it put it into the grid and at the cost price, which is determined by the price of gas. So that's another thing. Political will could bring about a reduction in electricity prices, but we can't sort of say that if we haven't made the congruent actions in our lives, and can talk about that.
Thank you. I think we might move on to our question 4. I know we haven't done question 3, but we may get back to it. This is one which shifts us a little bit more towards the church, and the question is that as carbon emissions continue to rise and global warming continues, what role can the church play in helping to mitigate this? And indeed, what can any faith tradition contribute to the way that humanity approaches the climate crisis? And we can answer that from any perspective, but I wonder, Sam, do you want to start with something on this, I wonder?
I think the church has got a huge role to play and should have a voice in it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the church's message has been about personal individual salvation, exclusively, and nothing wrong about personal individual salvation, but just simply focusing on that, I think is actually not true to Scripture, it's not true to our faith, it's not true to the Christian tradition. I sometimes do some teaching in a college on creation theology, and there are quite a lot of the students there who are going to come on to be ordained, rather sort of say, well, why are we doing this? What's this got to do with mission? What's this got to do with the gospel? Now, if we're working, I mean, I think that would have been my view perhaps 50 years ago when I was trained, or more than 50 years ago now, training in ordination. We had nothing in creation theology at all. Nothing at all. It's only in the last 25, 30 years that I've begun to sort of really explore that. So the church has got a huge educational role to play in changing people's perceptions of our relationship with the rest of the world, with the planet. Huge part to play.
Thank you. Natalie, could I possibly bring you in from the floor for a moment? Natalie's our education officer here at Great St Mary's, and this feels like a good moment to say something about the Communicating Hope project that's going on at the moment, and particularly your work with schools.
Yeah. So we've started a project called Communicating Hope, Faith, Science and Sustainability, and our aim is to enable conversations between all kinds of people, but we've got a special focus on young people and children, being able to converse with scientists and other experts about the environment, and especially about their concerns. We know that climate anxiety is such a big problem now, especially for those growing up in a time when all the news seems to be bad news. And so it seemed really important to have a project that focuses on hope, hope being a Christian virtue and a virtue that's found in many faiths and many worldviews, something that can spur us to action, something that increases our sense of agency. And so we're hoping through this project to increase people's sense that they can make a difference and that it's worth making a difference. And so we've done various things. We've run a poetry competition, asking children to write about hope in the environment. We got over 70 entries to that, and we had responses from interfaith schools as well. And so it's kind of broadening the conversation between faiths, because we obviously have a lot in common, and the more we recognize that, the more maybe we can reduce the risk of wars and things like that. And also going into schools that are not necessarily faith schools, but helping with their RE provision. I went to one school and talked about the parable of the mustard seed, and the children themselves kind of read so much into that they are very small, but they can make a big difference in the world, that they are very small, but will grow to be adults who will have even more agency in the world. And yeah, I think if you give children these stories, which religions can provide so many good stories like that, then children are very intelligent and smart, and they will start to make links between what they're being taught in stories and what the world needs to see from them. And so, yeah, I think religion can make a really big difference in the world in that sense.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Claire and then Richard, I wonder whether you might want to, Claire, I don't know if you want to reflect on something to do with the church's capacity to do community organising and influencing, and then Richard, perhaps the more public theology side of that. I don't know whether those are things you'd like to reflect on for us and how those things might help.
Not entirely sure what you mean, actually, about the church community organising. Do you mean within the church or within the wider community?
I suppose I'm being optimistic and assuming that the sorts of things that we talk about in church might empower people either to do things as a church that make a difference, or to empower people and resource people to go out of the church door at the end of the service and join in groups, be activist, I suppose.
Yes, definitely. In the eco group here at Great St Mary's, I remember us going over to HSBC Bank, and Andrew here almost got arrested because he tried to take a photo of us standing in the bank with our banners. We said we'd come and visit him in prison. So it's when you do things as groups, and whether that's in a church or churches with meeting with secular groups or secular organisations. The church obviously has a strong moral message of caring for the most vulnerable and caring for creation, and that's something I feel we can offer to the environment movement and the world as a whole. It's one more thing. As climate change digs in, these buildings, could also be a place of sanctuary, a place of warmth in the winter, cool in the summer. I know that adds more problems to deal with, but
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was very pleased to hear about the work in schools, Natalie, because, eco-anxiety, eco-nihilism, the concerns that younger people have. During the sermon, I was looking at the choir, and I was thinking it would be great to hear from some of our younger folks about their concerns about these issues, because they don't really have much of a voice. And I do think, part of our public theology could be to, elevate the voices of younger people. They don't currently you can't vote until 18, is that right? But there was a move to lower the age to 16, which I believe was unsuccessful, am I right? I've heard the news. So I think, we need to be communities of hope. The church should be the best community of hope there is. And that partly, as I said, comes through political action. And I do wonder about whether, Don was talking about the short-termism, and that's really related to politics as well, that, people are just thinking, politicians aren't even thinking about the next election cycle, they're thinking about the next public opinion poll. And, and it's such short-term thinking, which goes to the hot-button issues. Labour Party has been very, very disappointing. With a huge mandate, they just simply haven't delivered. But that's across all political parties. In the Psalms we read, some people put their trust or hope in chariots, but we put our hope in the Lord. Some people put their hope in princes, but their plans turn to dust. And I think when we read the Psalms, we need to remember this. Our hope is in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not some politician or some technology or something that will just wither away eventually. Our hope is in the Lord.
Thank you, Richard. Charlotte, if I could come to you briefly. I think we've all had an insight, sort of lifted the flap and seen what the existential risk people are dealing with every day in their daily work, and the kinds of questions that you're addressing. And we talked about eco-anxiety as well. There has to be an impact, presumably, on you and your colleagues in dealing with these kinds of questions all the time. What can your churches do to help support you in your work?
I think you're addressing something really important there, and it really resonates with what Richard and Natalie have said. I think sort of very briefly, and I do promise there is a point to this, coming back to the question about sacrifices, I think the biggest sacrifice asked of every single one is to not close our eyes to the problems. I think much, much bigger a sacrifice than not flying or not eating meat or whatever else we might want to come up with is actually thinking, oh goodness, there's something really bad going on here. And maybe I'm even a part of the problem. That takes massive, massive courage to actually acknowledge that. And Ellie, you mentioned that to some degree scientists are already doing that. People in working existential risk are already doing that. I think many times we're actually hiding behind this being a very, very academic field of study, very abstract, very sort of up here, rather than acknowledging, no, this is actually our lives. This is not just an abstract academic field of study. And in my opinion, that is really something where the church can play a huge role. Almost sort of resonating with Sam, this is also about individual spirituality, because these are individual human beings having to deal with incredibly heavy topics. And acknowledging that, and indeed if we encourage more and more people to reflect on these issues, having the awareness that more and more people might need a bit of help with that, be that spiritual help, be that psychological help, is incredibly important, and we see that already in our work to some degree, and I think we also need to bring that to a wider public, because we want that wider public to be aware, and being aware does come with some risks.
And we can be willing to pray for you and name those things in our prayers. Sam?
Some years ago I attended a meeting of representatives from world religions, meeting with the climate scientists at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change. Yes, IPCC. They spoke for about 20 minutes about the situation as they saw it, and did say that they were being very cautious in what they said as well. But they said, we're speaking to you, and we've asked to speak to you because we can give you, we know that facts alone do not change people's behavior. Facts alone do not change people's behavior. What needs to change is their hearts, their hearts and their wills. And we believe that as people of religion, and we're speaking to all representatives of all major religions, you are in the business of changing people's hearts, changing people's perspectives. And I believe that is so. That's what we are about. Yeah, thank you.
It's lovely to hear you say that, because that's my view of the world as well. I think that all the world's major religions, their major function, the major reason that they are functioning is because they present to lots of individuals a code of living, a way to do things in a moral way, a way to do things in the way that they are told and believe that it is what God would want, is a terribly powerful thing to say to people. And so I think that that's something which is the case for the world's religions, as you said, Sam, but it's also the case for individual places of worship like Great St. Mary's Church or any other church, that there are possibilities to inform people about what is a right thing to do and what is not a right thing to do. And in some cases, that needs some quite detailed thinking. The sort of things we've been talking about, as everybody here will appreciate, are quite complex things. And actually knowing what you ought to do is not all that straightforward, and it is contrary to your view of what I ought to do is to earn more money every year. And probably the answer is you should earn less money every year, because you need to do something to improve the whole world and not just to improve what you're going to spend your money on next year. So that is a major change of thinking for most people in the world, to have that kind of thing said to them. So I think there is a need for moral change where people are starting to think more widely and to do things in a more responsible way, and that churches can do that. And the kind of things that the project that Natalie is involved with is doing, going out and educating and talking to young people or talking to anybody who will listen, is a valuable thing to do. And telling people you need to change your thinking is an important thing. The other thing which is absolutely vital, which I think everybody here has said, is everybody can do something about the major lack of sustainability of lots of systems in the world, climate change being one of them, and it's by far from the only one. I think biodiversity loss is a bigger problem in the world, and we're going to have water shortage in lots of parts of the world. There are other things which are major problems in the world, but we need to know about it. We need to have scientific information, good quality information, but we need to have information which is presented as this is something which you can do in your daily life. every single individual can do something about these major issues that we're talking about. It's not something that you leave to politicians. You might influence politicians by voting for the ones who do something that you'd like to see them do, but it is something that every person in this room can do something to improve what is happening in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on.
So I think what we're talking about is an ecosystem of change in which individual action, research-based information and explanation of it, and institutions and governments enabling the right kind of changes to happen, all have to, the moving parts of all of that have to be working together in order to reverse some of the changes that we're already seeing, or at least build resilience in dealing with them. That feels like an enormously challenging thing to do, to get all that working right, and to get that all sort of working, yeah.
Just a very brief, am I on? Yes. Yeah. Just a brief thing. I mean, we talk and we use the language of sacrifice and burdens of giving up and so on. I think actually to live more simply is fun. It's better. It's more enjoyable. It's richer. Actually, we could be living a richer, better, more enjoyable, more communal, more free sort of life, actually, if we addressed some of these issues.
Yes.
It's not all gloom and doom and gloom. It really isn't. I mean, the possibility is doom and gloom, but actually the possibility of change, or the way of change, is not doom and gloom.
And to learn ways of finding limitations on what we do to be liberating. As opposed to kind of constraining. There is something about accepting givens in terms of ways of behaving and ways of living, and how we interact with the world, that we will ultimately find life-giving if we can learn to love them and to want that simpler existence. We are rapidly running out of time, and we have raised some very, very big questions indeed. I think we've talked quite a bit about the relationship between the technological approach, the political approach, and the kind of the moral individual approach and the spiritual approach. But I want to let us finish, if we may, with a very quick fire from each of us, answer to how would you characterize the kind of hope we need to have in order to address this? Who would like to go first, or who already has a one-sentence, fully formed answer that we can take away on this?
We have to have a very bold, brave hope, and be open-eyed and talk to people, discuss it.
So a conversational, open-minded,
Yes,
open-hearted, and
with
bold hope.
all groups who are working hard. There's so many groups, and I feel they need to sort of join the dots and work together a bit more.
A connected hope.
A connected hope, yes.
Brilliant. Richard.
I think we need to offer hope to each other, but also to the world. Part of that is a limitation on our greed as individuals, but also as a nation. What hope can we offer to a Pacific Islander who's about to, whose land is inundated by seawater? How do we offer hope? As well as, we think about receiving hope, but I think we also need to think about offering and being a beacon of hope.
Thank you. Do you have a one sentence?
Yes, I
Awesome.
do, and I'm going to go rogue. I'll say what kind of hope we don't want with this, and that is blind hope. The blind hope to, things will just be better, is going to be incredibly unhelpful, because unless we do things, they're not going to be better. So it needs to be hope that actually leads to action and not to inaction.
Thank you.
I would just say that every action we make, every vote we cast, every protest we're on, is actually a sign of hope. Is actually a sign of hope. The food we eat is a way of declaring your hope. The way we travel is a way of declaring your hope, of living your hope.
I think one of the things that churches do is to encourage people to distinguish between what is selfish and what is for the benefit of all. And that identification is terribly important, especially in the circumstance where, in order to decide what to do, we have to have good quality information. So actually helping people to distinguish good quality information. I think we call that education. But helping to identify the things which are not aimed at helping the world, but what are aimed at helping a very small subsection of the world, as was mentioned earlier on. I think that is something which can be done here, but we certainly need to be able to tell people how to use the information which is accurate, where to find it and how to use it. And I'm speaking, of course, as a scientist, but I think that we do need to have good quality factual information. And if we have that, we then can do something valuable. Every individual can. And believing that every individual can do something important is really a good thing.
A well-informed hope. And Claire, do you want to plug the film right now?
Yes. Well, talking about good quality information, I'm just giving a plug for something called the National Emergency Briefing. And there's this happened in November in Westminster, where 11 international experts got together and they gave a presentation. They were aiming it for MPs. 1,200 people turned up, and the briefings are really high quality, and they're very succinct. And it's going to be made into a sort of documentary feature film. That's coming out on April the 7th, and there's going to be a screening at Pembroke Auditorium on the 18th of April. That's a Saturday at 6 p.m, and it's free to attend. So that would be a useful way to update your knowledge about climate change and the very many risks it poses. I mean, it was particularly sobering what they said about health and food and geopolitical instability. So, well worth watching.
Thank you. We have reached our hour mark. Would you like to have another 10 minutes in order to have questions, or are your heads and hearts full? Are we full? In which case, can I take this opportunity to thank you all for coming, and a huge thank you to Richard and Claire, to Charlotte, to Sam and to Don, and to Natalie for being part of this. We've posed some extraordinarily difficult questions, and we've found some more difficult questions and trying to answer them. There are not simple solutions to many of these things, but I think we have identified some principles which are really important that we can take away with us. And I hope that as a church and as individuals and as the members of all the communities that are represented here, we'll have a sense of what kind of hope it is that we want to cultivate within ourselves, within the networks that we occupy, and in our interactions with others. So I hope there is something here that you've been able to take away today that will hopefully encourage you and help shape your own response. But thank you to you all, and thank you for coming.